now we'll change lanes. We'll join with John Paitakes with the Department of Criminal Justice at Seton Hall University. He's here to talk about the juvenile justice system here in the U.S. in the aftermath of a shooting by a 17-year-old. And of course, this raises the whole subject of how we treat younger violators, particularly those who commit serious crimes. Let's start first with, we know that the Justice Department has been loath to impose a death penalty on teenagers, but they have given them life sentences, and now I understand the Supreme Court is taking up that issue.
Yeah, right now, in fact, Ohio has life imprisonment without parole, okay? And so several states have already overturned that, thinking that that might be excessive or whatever. They can still get life imprisonment, which could be either 25 or 30 years, okay? And so, and obviously by exposing the juvenile to the adult system, it exposes them to a longer incarceration and also a jury trial. Remember, in the juvenile court, there's no trial by jury. The judge acts as judge and jury. So that changes the complexion.
When you're talking about a juvenile, that can be defined many ways depending on what state. Are you talking an 11-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 17 and 10-month-old? And how does that factor in? Because when you're talking about juveniles, the hope is there would be reform.
Yes, and generally there is more rehabilitation offered in the juvenile institutions than the adult, and that's something the court has to consider.
Well,
okay?
Because some people say putting them in juvie, wherever they put them, teaches them to be a better criminal.
Well, putting them in the adult prisons or correctional institutions certainly encourages, criminalization. But again, there's shorter terms under the juvenile system. You stay in the juvenile court, and usually it's either to age majority 21, or they can go 10, 15 years. And there's mandatory education and mandatory counseling. In the adult system, it's not mandatory to take rehabilitation programs. It's not mandatory to get your GED in most states. So again, the balance is, rehabilitation versus punishment. Obviously, the severity of the court, and the victim's input has a lot to do with it. But there's 3 different procedures to consider that, and every state is different. And when you said 11-year-olds, you're right. There are some states at 11 years old, if you do a major crime, you can be considered to be waived to the adult court. In most states, it's either 14 or 16.
Do you know what states that would consider an 11-year-old an adult?
There's 1 or 2 Midwestern states. Yeah.
Well, what is the purpose, really, when you get down to it, waiving a juvenile to adult?
Right. The purpose is it exposes them to a longer period of incarceration. If the person is very dangerous or whatever, then society will be protected for a longer period of time, okay? The jury trial, which is much more comprehensive and evaluated than the one person evaluating. And just, a public outcry when they see a juvenile doing a serious crime, they want some, harsh punishment,
But there's a fine line depending on that age.
Yeah, that's true. And Americans have been caught up in this let's take a bite out of crime mentality and been very forceful. Of course, that mentality and this imposition on teenagers in imposing these laws has taken a very perhaps disproportionate impact on minority communities. We've seen the Sentencing Project in Washington, D.C. come out with numbers just a couple of years ago that talked about how many Black and Hispanic youngsters are disproportionately affected by these very harsh laws on teenagers.
Yeah. And that's being monitored very closely or whatever. But of course, when you look at the 3 ways, the judicial review to transfer somebody to adult court is probably the most comprehensive, where the judge has a special hearing and looks into the background, the economic conditions, any prior programs that were tried on that individual or whatever before they make that decision. And actually, most cases that are referred for adult hearing end up staying in the juvenile court when it's that type of hearing. Now, there are some states that have a statutory segment to it that says if you do an armed robbery or murder, you automatically go to the adult. And then the third one is a prosecutorial one where the prosecutor has the main say as to who goes to court. So,
let's get back to Ohio. You've got a 17-year-old white student who shot up 4 other students randomly, didn't know him. What's going to happen here?
Yeah, in fact, I just saw a recent news report on that within the next month or so, the prosecutor has to show to the court that there was enough probable cause that he was involved in those incidents, okay? And if that happens, then he's automatically going into the adult system, all right? So apparently...
Because he's just so close in age?
No, because that's the statute in that state.
Okay,
yeah. He hit the age requirement and the state law. And if the prosecutor can show that there's enough probable cause that he was involved, it's automatically going into the adult section. So then automatically he goes goes into adult section. He becomes eligible for bail. Remember, juveniles, for the most part, aren't eligible for bail under the juvenile system. So it opens up all the adult sanctions, you know, for that 17-year-old.
Should that be changed?
Should it be changed?
The bail.
There are a few states that for very serious crimes will give bail. Now, even though there's no bail, there's a detention hearing for a juvenile if he's locked up every 48 hours to determine whether he should stay in or not. You know.
Well, listen, this is a very difficult subject when you talk about imposing these kinds of harsh things on teenagers, and I would imagine the severity of the crime is part of that determination.
The severity of the crime, the prior, if he had a prior record, okay, and his emotional state also. I mean, there's a psychological that'll probably take place. But you know, the other interesting thing, Brian, is that when they did research on juveniles that were referred to the adult court and served a lengthy sentence, when they came out, they had a higher chance of being a repeat offender, all right? Mainly because they had been in a longer period of time, and you know, you become criminalized if you're in that environment, unfortunately, in many cases.
More susceptible to influence.
So there's not an easy answer.
Thank you for your time.
Anyway, well, thank you.
Thanks, John.